Hello, everyone. I'm joined by Dr. Nirav Pandya, who's going to help shed some light on the 49ers injury issue. As we know, the Niners have an injury issue. Part of it is just the nature of football, but part of it is off-season non-contact injuries that result in surgery. Most recently, Jeff Wilson Jr., Justin School, to various more, but in the past, Jerick McKinnon, as well, Jalen Hurd. What I'd like to ask you first, in general, are these non-contact football injuries generally completely random, or is there something that happened in the athlete's past that led to that moment?
That's a great question. I know a lot of people are interested in that. And, I think it's a combination of both. I think the number one thing whenever we see someone who, especially when there's a pattern of injuries, particularly within an organization, is what's their prior injury history? Did
Mm,
they have an ACL injury when they were younger? Did they have some sort of meniscus injury? But then once you've eliminated that, then you really have to look critically at what's going on in the off season. Are they training? Are they not training? What kind of
mm.
exercises are they doing? Particularly for those non-contact injuries, because, football by nature, it's violent. If they're contact injuries, there's not much to do about it. But those non-contact injuries, I think it's critical to look at how are they training and kind of what are they doing that's actually leading to them getting some of those injuries, particularly when you hear about people, standing up and getting a meniscus tear or just kind of having a muscle injury. So I think it's definitely a combination of things, but you critically have to look at how they're training in the off season.
Generally, would you say that these non-contact injuries are more a result of undertraining in the offseason or overtraining? And I'm talking that period between January and May when the players are on their own.
I think it's a pretty even split. I think with COVID this year, with some of the, even
Mm,
even with some of the, off-season programs, it's hard to say how much access individuals had to kind of regimented off-season training. So I think part of it may be that. But then I think you have the other group where everyone suddenly comes in and they're like, let me catch up. It's been 2 months, I'm back in, let me really try to catch up. So I think it's the lack of consistency in training as
mm.
opposed to one or the other. There's just such an ebb and flow. So I think the body really needs a nice balance. So you're either going to do a little bit and keep doing a little bit or do a lot and keep doing it. It's when you change that intensity where those kind of non-contact injuries will occur.
Okay, that makes sense. I want to ask you in particular about Jeff Wilson Jr. His injury happened a couple of month ago exactly, and
Right.
the Niners are calling it a freak injury. What happened was he was in the locker room, he was sitting down, he stood up and turned, and his meniscus tore. He's going to miss 4 to 6 months. They're saying that there's really nothing they can learn from it. Now, it they also said that he was doing a leg workout in their weight room under their supervision just before. Uh, do you think that it's possible the leg workout contributed and that's the most important data point, that workout, or should they be focused on what happened in the locker room the minute it tore?
I think in general, when you get, professional level athlete, you would assume that their meniscus, is good quality for all the beating it's kind of taken through the season. So could that one maneuver potentially injure a meniscus? Absolutely. But there's probably some degree of irritation or injury already taking place in that leg that contributed to it. So it could potentially be that leg workout, which was kind of the final thing that kind of pushed the knee over the edge. And then the muscles just weren't ready to really support the load. Or what it could potentially be is that everything that led up to that, and then his meniscus just ready to tear, and that was what actually caused it. So when we see like 50, 60, 70-year-olds, they can get up and tear their meniscus. It's not very typical for someone that age to get it. So I
Mm.
agree. I think you definitely have to look at what was the athlete doing right before that injury occurred, and what have they been doing for the week or two before that, that may have actually put strain on the knee.
Yeah, it seems that that's the key point, that the Niners, they keep talking about how it happened, but they may find they're probably going to find more information and more insight if they focus on the previous 2 weeks and even the previous 2 hours.
Exactly right, and that's where I think the important thing is. I mean, we obviously know before, with Trent Baalke and that, they were drafting players who are injured, but now it's like, okay, we've got these injuries, different regime, different players getting drafted. Now it's time for them to actually say, let's look at our offseason training program, let's look at what we're doing, and let's see if we find a pattern, let's act on it. And I think that you can always place blame if people don't act on it. I think now they have a good amount of information where they can actually look at it critically and say, what can we do to prevent these injuries? Because as you mentioned, if all these people can be healthy, the 49ers have a great roster. But
Mhm.
if you can't keep these people healthy, whether it be things that you can modify, then you're going to be looking at, middle of the season where they're wondering where are all our players are not healthy when we could have acted on it early in the season.
The NFL has done so much the past 10 years to limit contact in practices for players. This has been collectively bargained. But coaches are still going to want to get their work in for their players. And it seems like they compensate by doing a lot of running and competing without contact. And so you
Right.
see a big uptick in these non-contact injuries in the offseason. Is that something you've seen like league wide a trend of?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's interesting when you look back in the 80s and 90s where people were, doing a lot of contact. You'd see the ACL tear or the fracture, but now
Mm,
you're seeing a lot more of these soft tissue injuries. And I think it's
mm,
from twofold. Number one, what you talk about, absolutely the lack of contact. So you're spending that time doing something else. You're doing it where you're actually going to place those hamstrings, those Achilles at more
mm.
risk. I think the other thing you're also seeing as well too is that a lot of teams are doing these intense 90-minute practices where you're not out there for 3 to 4 hours. So it's like,
Right.
let's get all this work in 90 minutes. And there's very little time for recovery, and you're doing explosive activities. So yes, you're not pounding your body by hitting one another, but you're out there and you're going 90, 95% all the time, which probably places you at risk for these injuries. And it would be interesting to look at when these injuries are occurring in practice. Are they occurring at the beginning, when they're not warmed up, or are they occurring at the end where they're getting very fatigued? So it's like minute 75, minute 76, where they've
Mm.
done these explosive things. So I agree with you. It's the way they're practicing, which I think across the NFL it's happening, but particularly maybe there's something that they're doing within those period of time for the 49ers that they may need to change a little bit.
Final question. If the 49ers
Yeah.
came to you and said, Nirav, what would you suggest we do to reduce these injuries? It's an 8-year problem. We can't find a solution. What would you suggest?
Yeah. Well, I think number one is in taking a critical look at number one, what these injury histories of these players are, not just saying like, hey, do you have an ACL? It's like, did they have a lot of soft tissue injuries when they're younger?
Mm,
Looking at how they're running, how they're jumping. Because I think the number one thing is if you get a sense of the player, and let's take a look at those things you can modify. Let's modify how your strength training is, what kind of flexibility is, and maybe we have to back off a little bit in terms of how we're doing. So I think number one, looking at their history. Number two, critically looking at our training and maybe decrease the amount of explosive activity,
mm.
especially with the longer season now. You've got an additional game. Let's preserve their body. Because I think a lot of these players, they're athletic. They clearly are talented. Do we really need to be pounding their body in this different way in practice? So I try to cut back a little bit and maybe work more on prevention in practice. So instead of doing necessarily football specific drills, let's spend 15, 20 minutes working on those things that can keep us healthy for the season. Because a lot of these players, it's what gets the 49ers last year is not necessarily the fact that they're not skilled. It's because no one's available. So let's maybe shift that around and say, what can we do to prevent these injuries so everyone can be healthy? So I would definitely do a lot of injury prevention, make sure they're drafting players that don't have these kind of little injuries that have kind of plagued them maybe in high school and college. And then really just preserve them. Because if you can get players healthy for 17 weeks, that's the important thing. And they're going to pick up the skills from playing the game. Obviously I'm not a football coach, but I feel that at this level, they definitely have the skills and they can get the reps without stressing their bodies.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, there's an extra week now in the season, all
Yeah.
the more reason to focus on rest and prevention. Nirav, thank you so much. This was extremely interesting. I appreciate it.
And thanks for having me, Grant. Appreciate it.